Hello and welcome to Newsclick's International Roundup. Today we go to Bolivia, where Evo Morales resigned from his post of president on Sunday after the army joined the coup efforts against him, being led by the right-wing opposition. Morales had won the country's general elections and had become the president after securing 47% of the votes and winning an over 10-point lead over the opposition candidate Carlos Mesa. So to talk more about this, we have with us Prabir Purkayastha. So Prabir, can you first tell us about the chain of events that led to Morales resigning?
Let's see what has happened first in very broad terms. That this is a part of the right-wing offensive in Latin America, and this has led to different places losses on the left. First we saw Brazil, Bolsonaro winning, and also that needed Lula to be put in prison, which fortunately he has just been released from. We also saw the attack on President Maduro. And of course we've had also reverses electorally earlier in some of the Latin American countries. But nevertheless, the left has held. And in Bolivia, where we had the first indigenous president, which is Evo Morales, and also as recent left-wing candidates have recently won elections both in Mexico and in Argentina. So this is not only that the left is on the defensive in Latin America, there is a fluidity in the situation in which certain things are starting to happen on both sides. But Evo Morales has been ruling for 14 years. He had given Bolivia stability, high growth rates in Latin America, which was preserved against the kind of crisis that we have seen in other places. So it was not surprising that Evo Morales was leading in the all the predictions that took place before the elections. The only question was, will he get a 10% margin or not, which means no runoff would be required. And if no runoff is required, then he becomes the president. If a runoff takes place, the argument is everybody could combine against him, and then there is a possibility he might lose the election. This is the whole scenario that was being spun at that point. The point is that nobody denies that Evo had a clear lead in the election. Did he have a 10% lead? That was the only controversy that was there. Argument was that he had a 8% or a 9% lead, and this was fraudulently, according to the right wing, fraudulently converted to a 10% lead, and that's all that the Organization of American States, OAS delegation, has claimed. As you know, OAS has been more or less under American influence, if not control. The OAS had made a set of demands to Evo that, considering there is a controversy with the elections, and prima facie they claimed they had evidence that the election could have been manipulated, they said there should be fresh elections. Evo had agreed to all the demands, had agreed to fresh elections and said, yes, let's have a fresh elections, and whatever OAS was saying as the condition for the new elections, Evo had already agreed to. This was not sufficient, which meant the opposition did not want an election. They didn't really want a free and fair elections. And then the police coup followed by the military pressure and the attacks on the homes, the lawmakers who belonged to Evo's party made slowly it difficult for Evo's party to hold against what was essentially happening on the streets. There was a lawmaker who was actually attacked physically, and she had her hair cut. The mayor, and pictures are available. But it's also important that some of the people resigned, saying we are in danger of our families being attacked, therefore we cannot continue. So this was a large-scale violence unleashed by the opposition, backed by the United States and other right-wing formations in Latin America. At the end of it, Bolivia is a small country. And finally, the revolt of the police as well as the army. And the army chief basically is saying that Evo Morales has to step down and for a new election to take place, and therefore essentially converting what was protests to a coup. Because once the police and the military take over and demand that somebody go, it's no longer a question of a democratic verdict, it's a question of a gun being held to your head, because that's what the police and military are. And this is why this is nothing but a coup. There have been different protests from different leaders of the world calling this as a coup. And I think the worldwide opinion for those who understand what is happening, what is behind a lot of this so-called constitutional coups, Guaido first in Venezuela, and various other constitutional coups keeping Lula out of the presidential election in Brazil. All of these are essentially instrument now of not direct military rule, but constitutional coups which the entrenched oligarchy in Latin America is re-acquiring power. Earlier they did it through military coups. Now it is taking place indirectly through what would be called constitutional coups. We see this in Honduras also similarly, that you get rid of the elected president under various guise, under various cover, and then you essentially quote unquote elect a new government. And that, of course, since it's done under the gun, it does go one way. So the fact that they did not want an election, but they have forced Evo Morales to resign, the first indigenous president in the whole of Latin America, tells its own tale, that this is essentially a coup by the oligarchy with the support of the police and military.
And can you tell us more about the global responses this has received?
Well, you know, it was expected, of course, that Venezuela would oppose what has happened, because they've been facing a very similar coup attempt in Venezuela itself. And that was this so-called Guaido being suddenly declared as a interim president of Venezuela without any process. And this on the basis of, again, the same set of forces internationally. What we have seen is both the president-elect of Mexico and Argentina, both have asserted their support for Evo Morales and said this is a coup. We have also Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party in UK, giving voice to the same set of issues, saying that this is a coup. Now, this is really something which is important, because in the Western world, I'm saying Western, of course, with this understanding that 8 to 10 countries in the world claim they represent the whole of humanity. When it comes to bourgeois democracy, liberal democracy, they are the voices of the people, of course, forgetting their colonial past and the whole bloody history they've had in overthrowing democratically elected governments. There, Jeremy Corbyn coming out in clear-cut terms saying this is a coup. I think that's important, because the first time we have a major leader of a Western party, a Western country saying this. We've also had left in different parts of the world, for instance in India, the Communist Party of India, Marxists has condemned the coup. So I think we are going to find different voices takes place in different parts of the world. But the real issue is going to be Latin America, and there the most important voice today is really Lula's. He's just come out of prison. He has been, as we know, has been held illegally for more than 580 days. The Brazilian Supreme Court has said nobody should be put behind bars till the appeal process is exhausted. And it is also clear that he was deprived of the possible presidency by being declared that a crime had been committed for which no direct proof was ever given. But we know that this was a conspiracy between Judge Moro, who later on became the Justice Minister in the new government, right-wing government, and the prosecution. So now we know that, because all those telephone conversations, messages, etc. are all out in the public domain. So as a conspiracy, he was ousted. He is now released. He could not contest as president, which is why Bolsonaro really won, otherwise he would have lost. But his voice has also been added. So I think in Latin America you will see a strong voice against what's happened. And I think this kind of coup attempts in the long run is going to backfire on the right-wing oligarchy. I think it delegitimizes whatever they're doing more and more. And it's a matter of time just like the army coups which took place in 60s, 70s and 80s, this method of intervening in other countries, particularly Latin America, through what would be called constitutional coups, these are going to be increasingly rendered illegitimate by the very act what's happening today in Bolivia, where the opposition does not want an election but wants to dispossess Evo Morales of the presidency by virtue of the police and military.
And as you have been talking, this is part of the right-wing offensive in Latin America. So what will be the implications of this for the people of Bolivia, particularly for the indigents and the working classes right now, like instantly, not just in the long term, and also for the Latin American region?
See, I think it's very clear that you are going to see large-scale repression. Now, to the extent that this repression is backed by the police and military, I think we are facing really hard times in Bolivia. The only issue that is there, and I think that is something which will prevail in the medium term, if not in the short term, is that the kind of gains the Bolivian people have made, particularly its indigenous population, which is a significant number in Bolivia, it's not that easy to dial back all those gains. And the oligarchy, being an oligarchy, is going to try and do that immediately, because they have been without power for 14 years. They are really hungry for immediate gains, and we saw that in Brazil as well. So looting the state and therefore consequently looting the people's wealth is the next step that the oligarchy is going to do. So I think you are going to see short-term violence, particularly against the activists, particularly against the party which Evo Morales had built, and particularly against the indigenous movements. I think we are going to see that. But how much international support we can muster, what is the reaction of the people on that, that's something we have to see. I do not believe that the issues in Bolivia are just going to be resolved in Bolivia, because I think they are today part of a larger sweep of the politics in Latin America. And this is also, I would say, the last ditch effort of the United States to keep Latin America as their private preserve. We know they did it in the 19th, early 20th century under the Monroe Doctrine. We know they did it after the Second World War using the military and the police and the oligarchy. Now they have the facade of democracy and constitutional coups, but behind we have the Trump-Pompeo duo, whose policy regarding Venezuela has been even more openly right-wing, openly confrontationist and openly illegal, seizing Venezuela's oil resources, putting illegal bans on the Venezuelan government, supporting a government which is a figment of their imagination. These are all ways they have gone, supporting Bolsonaro in different ways. Of course, the quid pro quo is immediate. You hand over all your resources, and Venezuela, Guaido is going to hand over whatever resources he has to the United States if he physically regains power over there. So all of this would show that in this policy of direct loot backed by the kind of forces which the United States is now backing, I think this cannot be a long-term change that it's instituted in Latin America. I think it's a short-term change, and I think it's going to only rebound on the United States and the oligarchy.
Thank you, Prabir, for talking to us today. And that's all the time we have. Keep watching Newsclick.